What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. We'd also like to give a special shout out to one of Not Your Average Meta's generous patrons, Martin Stanley, for everything he's done to help out the channel. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we've apparently got ourselves a good old-fashioned broccoli showdown, which has each player playing a deck using the color green. This week's matchup features Adam making a return playing the mono-green D&D Secret Lair commander Doric, Nature's Warden, Donald, the Master of Cycling, making his first appearance on the channel since episode 85 of Season 3, playing Roon of the Hidden Realm, Fulgral playing his Ravenous Rhino deck being led by Ghired, Conclave Exile, and Javon playing his first game on the channel since episode 6 of Season 1, once again rocking Ezuri Renegade Leader. Now that we have our fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Adam plays a Forest, while Donald plays a tapped Tranquil Thicket. Fog plays a Cabaret Courtyard for turn before sacking it, which has him gaining a life and going to get his own forest to put into play. Javon plays his own forest for turn before paying 1 for Finhorn Elves. Adam plays a second forest for turn before passing to Donald, who plays a tapped Sunpetal Grove. Fog plays a Plains for turn before then paying 2 to cast Rampant Growth, going to get a mountain from his library to put into play tapped. Javon draws for turn and then plays a Dryad Arbor before paying 1 and casting Quarian Rangers. Adam plays another forest for turn before paying 3 for Runic Armasaur. On his instep, Donald pays 1 to cycle a land and draw a card before playing a Windswept Heath. Fog plays a second Plains for turn before paying 2 to cast an Arcane Signet and then helps the table out by paying 3 for an Overabundance. Javon uses his Finhorn Elves before tapping his mana to create 2 forests and then bouncing it back to his hand, replaying it, and then tapping his Finhorn Elves again to help cast a Natural Order. He then sacks the Elves to the Natural Order in order to go get a Nyxbloom Ancient from his library to put into play. He then taps his Dryad Arbor in his land, taking 2 damage in order to help cast Vivian, Monster's Advocate. He then uses the rest of his floating mana to cast a Staff of Domination and then upticks Vivian to create a Beast token with Reach. Adam plays a 4th forest for turn and then casts a fully kicked Tranquil Frillback, which has him destroying the Staff of Domination and then gaining 4 life, while he exiles Javon's graveyard. Adam then casts a Rabid Bite, which has him targeting his Frillback and Javon's Quarian Rangers. The Ranger then goes to his graveyard, and on his instep, Donald pays a life to crack his Windswept Heath and go get a tapped Hallowed Fountain. Donald then untaps and draws for turn before playing a Reliquary Tower and paying 3 to cast an Eternal Witness, which has him returning the Windswept Heath from his graveyard back to his hand. Fog plays another Plains for turn before he then takes 3 damage in order to help cast his commander Ghired, which has him entering with a 4/4 Rhino token. He then uses his Arcane Signet and floating mana to cast a Harmonic Prodigy before passing turn. Javon plays a Gaia's Cradle for turn before he then pays to cast a Priest of Titania. He then also casts a Slate of Ancestry before tapping his Cradle to help him cast a Beast Within, targeting Adam's Runic Armasaur. Adam then gets a 3/3 Beast token and Javon uses his floating mana to help cast his commander Ezuri. Javon then uses more of his floating mana to activate a Slate of Ancestry, discarding his hand and drawing 5 new cards. He then pays to cast Sylvan Library as well as Adamri Lord of Leaves, which then has Donald responding by casting a Mystic Snake in order to counter the spell. Eladamri then gets countered and Javon upticks Vivian, once again creating another Beast token. Adam plays another Forest for turn before losing 5 life to help cast Nissa, Who Shakes the World. He then taps another Forest, losing another life in order to help cast his commander Doric, Nature's Warden. Adam then goes into his library to find a Forest card to put into play tapped before he loses another life in order to help cast a Barrier's Breach, which has him exiling Javon's Nyxbloom Ancient as well as the Sylvan Library along with Fog's Overabundance. In response, Fog taps 2 Plains and loses 2 life in order to cast your Temple is under attack, choosing himself and Javon to both draw 2 cards. The enchantments all then get exiled and Adam upticks Nissa in order to untap one of his forests and turn it into a creature. Donald floats a mana off his Tranquil Thicket before playing an Exorius Chancery, bouncing the Thicket back to his hand. He then uses the floating mana to cycle the Thicket, drawing a card before passing turn. Fog draws, then plays a tapped Thrawn Portal, choosing Forest as it enters play. He then pays to suspend a Crashing Footfalls for 4 before he then goes to combat, swinging his commander Donald and one of his rhinos over at Adam. This then has him creating 2 more tapped and attacking rhinos, which he has 1 going at Javon and 1 going at Donald. This then has Adam blocking with his beast token and taking 1 damage, while Donald doesn't block and goes to 29 life, and Javon blocks with 1 of his beast tokens, destroying 1 of Fogg's rhinos. Javon plays another force for turn and then pays to cast an Arbor Elf and then an Umbral Mantle. Donald then responds by casting a Displace to flicker both of his creatures, which has the Mystic Snake countering the Umbral Mantle and the Eternal Witness coming back into play, returning the Displace back to his hand from his graveyard. Javon then pays to once again use his slate to discard his hand and draw 5 new cards. He then once again upticks Vivian to create another beast token before tapping his priest to help him cast a Growing Rites of Itlimoc. This then has him looking at the top 4 cards of his library and revealing Savala Heart of the Wild, which he then puts into his hand. Javon then ends his turn, which has his enchantment transforming into Itlimoc, Cradle of the Sun. Adam draws for turn and then taps out to cast Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, which has him drawing 4 cards. He then upticks Nissa to untap 1 of his force once again, turning it into a creature. He then uses his 2 force creatures in order to cast a Bear Umber, which he uses to enchant his commander. Adam then goes to combat, sending his commander over Javon, which then has him paying the 2 to activate her ability, transforming her into Doric, Owlbear Avenger. This then has him untapping all of his lands because of his Bear Umbra, and Javon declaring blocked, which is enough to have him taking no damage. Javon then pays to cast a Crop Rotation, sacrificing 1 of his forests in order to go get a Wirewood Lodge from his library, which he uses to untap his Priest of Titania. Adam then pays in order to cast an Ancient Bronze Dragon and then a Rowan before he then ends his turn. Donald replays his Windswept Heath for turn, paying the 1 life to go to his library and get a Tropical Island, before he then pays to cast an Eldrazi Displacer, passing his turn to Fogg. Fogg draws and plays another Plains for turn before he remembers to remove a counter from his Crashing Footfalls. Fogg then casts a Dauntless Escort and goes to combat, swinging his commander over Donald once again, while he has his 2 attacking rhinos coming into play, attacking Javon. Javon then declares blocks, and in response, Fogg casts a Rootborn Defense to make his creatures indestructible and has him populating 1 more rhino token. Javon draws for turn and then plays a forest before paying to cast a Beast Whisperer. He then casts a Devoted Druid, drawing a card before he then pays to cast Survival of the Fittest. This then has Donald responding by paying to use the Eldrazi Displacer to emphatically flicker his Mystic Snake, countering the spell. The spell then gets countered and Javon once again uses the Slate of Ancestry to discard his hand and draw 7 new cards. Javon then casts a Wirewood Herald, drawing a card, before he then uses his Wirewood Lodge to help untap his Priest of Titania. Javon then pays 3 to cast an Eternal Witness, returning his Beast Within back to his hand from his graveyard. Javon then pays to cast a Beast Within, targeting Kozilek, which has Adam responding by casting Bombardi's Song, giving his creature Hexproof until end of turn and getting tempted by the ring. This then has Adam's commander becoming his Ring Bearer, while Javon casts a Green Sun Zenith where X is equal to 5. He then goes into his library to get a Seedborn Muse to put into play before he upticks Vivian, once again creating another beast token. On his upkeep, Adam's commander transforms back into Doric, Nature's Warden, and Javon activates his slate, once again discarding his hand and drawing 10 new cards. He then filters the rest of his floating mana into his commander, pumping up the rest of his elves, and Adam reveals the top card of his library, which is a Heroic Intervention. Adam then pays to cast Awakening and V2 Ghazi, which has him putting 9 +1/+1 counters on one of his lands that he already turned into a creature. He then upticks Nissa, once again untapping one of his forests and turning it into a creature. Adam then pays to enchant his giant land creature with a Hydra's Growth, adding an additional +1/+1 counter to it. Adam then goes to combat, swinging all of his available creatures over at Javon, while he also pays to transform his commander once again. This then gives all of his legendary creatures +2/+2 in trample and untaps all of his lands because of the Bear Umbra. Before blocks are declared, Javon taps and untaps a bunch of his lands and his elves in order to use his commander's ability in order to pump his elves up enough to block Adam's creatures before he then sacks 4 permanents to the Annihilator trigger. Blocks are then declared, which has Adam's board pretty much getting wiped out, as well as a Bear Ember falling off his commander. With Kozilek dying, he then shuffles his graveyard back into his library, before he then casts Ezuri Reaches Skyward, going to get a forest from his library to put into his hand. Donald then cuts Adam's deck for him before Adam then plays a forest and passes his turn to Donald, who draws for turn. Donald then pays to cast a Green Sun Zenith the Zone, where X is equal to 2. He then goes into his library to get an Incubation Druid, putting it into play while he passes his turn to Fog. Fog untaps and removes his suspension counter off of his Crashing Footfalls before he then draws and passes his turn. On his end step, Javon casts a Noxious Revival to put Eladamri back on top of his library from his graveyard. He then untaps return and draws a card he put on top of his library. Javon then plays a Cavern of Souls naming elves before he pays 1 to cast an Allosaurus Shepherd, making his spells double uncounterable. Javon then pays to recast Eladamri Lord of Leaves before using a bunch of tapping and untapping shenanigans to make all of his elves ungodly big using his commander's ability. He then goes to combat and swings all of his giant Forest Walk elves over at Adam, taking Adam out of the game. On his end step, Donald pays to use the Displacer in order to flicker his Eternal Witness, getting his Windswept Heath back to his hand. He then untaps return and draws, while Javon also untaps all of his permanents. Donald then once again plays his Windswept Heath and cracks it, losing a life in order to go get a forest from his library. He then pays to adapt his Incubation Druid, and in response, Javon uses a Slate of Ancestry to discard his hand once again and draw more cards. Donald then puts 3 counters on his Incubation Druid before then tapping it to help cast a Vigian Graph Mage. This then gives him infinite colored mana, which he uses to cast Life from the Loam, returning all the lands in his graveyard back to his hand. He then pays to cycle a land, drawing a card, before he then pays to cycle an additional land, drawing a second card. He then pays to cast Tatiova Benthic Druid and then cast a Displace, once again flickering his Eternal Witness. This then has him returning Loam back to his hand before he then recasts it, returning the lands back to his hand from his graveyard. He then pays to cycle another land, drawing a card, before he then cycles an additional card, but instead decides to dredge 3, returning the Loam back to his hand. He then recasts Loam a 3rd time, returning the lands back to his hand from his graveyard. He then cycles another land, drawing a card, before he then pays 4 and casts an Archaeomancer. This then returns the Displace from his graveyard back to his hand and allows him to recast it multiple times, drawing 50 cards. He then eventually gets to Venser Shaper Savant, which he casts and allows him to infinitely bounce everyone's permanents back to his hand, effectively winning him the game. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe in order to see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.